Hi everyone, welcome to AskAMogul. We have a very special guest today, Secretary Madeleine Albright. She is the very first female Secretary of State and is a former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Thank you so much for being here with us, Secretary Albright. It's a true honor.
Well, I'm delighted and nice to spend time with you.
Yes,
Thank you.
Pleasure. It's nice to meet a fellow redhead.
Right.
So we are going to be taking these questions from actual users in the Mogul community. And so the very first one comes from Danica, and she says, I love your quote, "There is a special place in hell for women who do not help other women." So why do you think women, especially young women, sometimes have a hard time supporting one another for the greater good of women everywhere?
Well, the quote really comes up from my own life, because when I was trying to do different things like go to graduate school while I had little children, other women were very critical of what I was doing. They would say, why are you spending more time with your children? And I cook better than you do. And we're not even not just not helpful, but really downright judgmental about what I was doing. So I do think that part of it has to do with our own issues in terms of thinking if we project our own sense of weakness on other women, and then there's a certain sense of jealousy, I think. There's the queen bee syndrome, thinking if there's only going to be one woman in the room, then I'm going to be that woman. When instead, I think we are all stronger if there's more than one woman in the room, and if you have a team of sisters that can be supportive of you. And so it's not kind of zero sum, but it is a matter of having more women in the room.
I think that's a wonderful point to make, and thank you. And that leads perfectly to our next question from user Jenna84. She says, as a trailblazer who has paved the way for women in leadership positions, particularly in politics, were there ever moments for you where you felt it was harder to have your voice heard? And how did you deal with those moments, if so?
Well, I think a number of times, frankly, because often as the only woman in the room, and I'm sure that every one of the women that are watching this has had this experience, you think to yourself, well, I want to say something, and then you think, well, no, it's going to sound stupid, so you don't say it, and then some man says it, and everybody keeps saying, you know, as Joe said, that was really terrific, and you are so mad at yourself for not saying something. And so I have trained myself, and I talk to other women about this, is to decide that you are going to interrupt no matter what. But in order to do that, you have to know what you're talking about and to have a strong voice and be determined. I kind of made up this term, active listening, to figure out when you should interrupt. Now, did it always work? No. And one of the things that does happen, and again, I bet this has happened to every woman, you argue for something very strongly, and somebody says, don't be so emotional. And I specifically, when I was ambassador at the United Nations, and I was very concerned about what was happening in Bosnia with ethnic cleansing, I said, you know, I was really arguing very hard, and I was told not to be so emotional. And so you learn to argue in somewhat of a different tone.
Absolutely. And so what would your advice be for women out there who really want to pursue politics? And why do you feel that particularly in 2017 it's really important for women to pursue and be politically active?
Well, first of all, women in this country and in many countries are more than half the population. And I think that we are robbing ourselves of a great set of people that can be contributors to solving problems. So that is number one. I also think that when there are more women in the political system, that it brings a different approach to things, and that we often have a capability of finding what, you know, a good diplomat or anybody that's involved, you need to put yourself into somebody else's shoes. We're pretty good about doing that. But mostly I believe that it's an important aspect of how our societies operate, to have women politically and economically empowered. And so it's a matter of just being smart to get more women involved. But it also is the idea of having more than one woman. I can't tell you how I keep stressing this, is you don't want to be the only woman in the room. It may make you feel like the queen bee, but it's much better to have other women with you and to really have a support system.
Absolutely. A sisterhood.
Yes,
in a way.
Absolutely.
Well, this leads pretty well to the next question. So Natasha asked from the platform, she says, what would you advise women do in today's political climate to help change the status quo and fight for gender equality and parity within the workplace?
Well, I think that what has to happen is to try to figure out what every workplace is a little bit different, but to make sure that women are accorded the jobs for which we are prepared. I don't think, one of the statements that I've made an awful lot of times is there's plenty of room for mediocre men, there is no room for mediocre women. So we really do have to push each other to work hard and to know what we're talking about and to deliver when you are asked to do a job and not make excuses. And I think an awful lot is more is asked of women. There's no question about that. But I do think that what has to happen is to know what your goals are, to support each other, to be qualified, and to be extra qualified. And then I think not to be put off. But it is that combination of knowing what we can accomplish and to get the skills in order to be able to do that, no matter what line of work it is. We cannot ask for favors, but we cannot be put down either.
Right, absolutely. And this, you touched upon this, that, you believe that societies are better off when women are politically and economically empowered, but what would you say we should do, and what would you advise, in terms of foreign policy in the areas, particularly in the Middle East, like Syria, where women are being enslaved, especially Yazidi women, by ISIS?
Well, I think that I'm chairman of the board of an organization called the National Democratic Institute, and one of the things that we do generally is to try to support women in political work and try to get women, teach women about how to run for office, how to support each other specifically. Then one of the things that has happened, unfortunately, is that as more women have run for office, there has been more violence against women and threats against their families. And I've been doing some work, or the National Democratic Institute has, with the United Nations in terms of it's a campaign called Not the Cost, so that one doesn't have to put up with having their family threatened if more women really run for office. But I do think having women in political office is important. And I think we also have to speak out on behalf of women, in the Yazidi women for one, but others that are not able to speak for themselves, and talk about the fact that injustice committed against women, enslavement, or any number of activities that take place, we need to speak out on behalf of other women. What we can't do, however, is completely mirror image that that everybody wants to be like an American woman. I have found that out, which I find very interesting, is that women want to have rights within the society in which they exist. And for instance, what was very interesting, after the end of the Cold War, I did a lot of surveys in Central and Eastern Europe and former communist countries. And it used to be that women in communist countries were liberated to do twice as much work. They were able to work, but they still had to take care of their families. And they wanted to have what they called normal lives, to be able to choose what they wanted to. And so for me, it is always the same word. Women need to have a choice to do what they want to. And we need to support the women to be able to choose what they want to do, not what their societies are telling them to do.
Right, and not us forcing ourselves
on them,
on what
exactly.
our culture on them.
Yeah.
And really sticking with Syria in particular, I was very curious to hear what you feel should be done to bring peace to the area concerning the Assad regime and with ISIS.
Well, I think it's an incredibly complicated question, and one of the things that has happened is not enough attention was paid initially to what was going on in Syria, and the situation in the Middle East is as complicated as anything because there are struggles that are historic, between Persians and Arabs, and then most Americans knew nothing about Islam, much less the difference between the Shia and the Sunni, but that's part of this also. And then some just plain a dictator wanting to control his country, Assad. And so I think that we have to keep working in the region with the local forces, and work towards some kind of a transitional government. That's my personal view. I think the fact that Assad used chemical weapons against his own people makes it impossible for us to be supportive of him, but we also do not want ISIS running the whole area. And what has happened is that as a result of unified work, that the ISIS has been kind of pushed out of a lot of territory. And so now the question is how to rebuild Syria in a way where the various differences are recognized, because not everybody is the same, and to really kind of look at local areas, what can be done. And there's a genuine question in terms of, is it really one country? There's so many differences in the borders that are there. So it's going to require not only American involvement, but kind of a regional approach to what is going on there. Very complex. And then the Russians are playing a peculiar role. And so it's truly about as complicated as any situation could possibly be.
Very complex,
yeah,
for sure, and ongoing. Well, turning now to North Korea, as one of the most high-profile American diplomats to ever set foot in North Korea, what were your takeaways from your time there, and what would your advice be to President Trump and the State Department on how we should really approach foreign policy with North Korea?
Well, the North Korean issue has been complicated since 1953, the end of the North Korean War, or the Korean War. And basically, we don't have a peace treaty with them. It's an armistice. And the North Koreans want to be recognized by the United States. That is their goal. In the meantime, they are doing perfectly horrible things to their own people, starving them in many ways and propagandizing to really hate Americans, there's no question. And they have, along the way, been developing a lot of weapons, and they have a 1 million-man army, and they are very dangerous. The story when the Clinton administration was in office is also a very complicated one. We had a number of agreements with them, and I went in 2000 there in order to talk to them about their missile limits and their nuclear programs. And it was very interesting because we don't have an embassy there, so you never kind of know what's going to happen. But my takeaway was that we don't gain by not knowing what's going on there. And what did happen was that we were in the middle of negotiations about missile limits. Kim Jong-il, the father of the current leader, did want to talk to us. And I spent time with him. He was not crazy. We were able to have some productive discussions. But then what happened was the election of 2000, and President Clinton's time was up. I briefed Secretary Powell on what we were doing, and he wanted to continue the talks. And then there was a headline in the Washington Post that said, Powell to continue Clinton policies on Korea. He was hauled in to the White House and told no way. So I hold no brief for the North Koreans. They have lied and cheated, but I think that we need to talk to them. And diplomacy and talks are not a gift to the other side. They are a way that you try to determine what the issues are and how to resolve them. But I also do think, and I teach a course on the national security tools that we have, there are not a lot of them, frankly. There are diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. There are the economic tools, which are aid and trade and sanctions, and then various levels of the threat or the use of force and intelligence and law enforcement. That's not a lot. So I wouldn't take any of the tools off the table. Right. But I do think that what is important is for us to look for ways to have diplomatic talks and to use the sanctions process, which I think has been important in terms of the sanctions that the Security Council has put on, multilateral sanctions that the Chinese and Russians voted for, and to not make idle threats. What I am most concerned about at the moment is an accident of some kind, where we are flying. We do need to have a deterrence posture, and that something happened that is an accident that then does lead to worse things.
So miscalculations.
Miscalculations,
Yeah, definitely
yes.
so.
Yeah.
And what you mentioned about tools really leads to our next question well. And I love how at Georgetown you really teach that the essence of foreign policy is really just getting somebody to do what you want, and that involves using different tools.
Yeah.
And so what would your advice be to President Trump on the tools that he should use concerning now the Iran deal?
Well, I think that he has already, taken a step that is not useful. What is interesting is the Iran deal was not just an American deal. It's a multilateral deal, the P5+1. Other countries have been involved. And the international system, the International Atomic Energy Agency, they have provided inspectors. They have gone, and they themselves have said that they have gotten better access out of the Iran, the agreement itself, than they ever had before. And so for the United States, all of a sudden, to decertify is not a good idea. And I think that one of the issues that's important to recognize is that there are many issues with Iran. I mean, you were talking about Syria and what's going on in the Middle East. Not everything was a part of the JPOA, the agreement itself. That had to do specifically with them giving up most of their centrifuges and sending their enriched uranium, getting rid of that. A number of very specific goals to do with their nuclear program, not with everything else. And I think the mistake is coupling everything together. And one can't say that their behavior is terrific, but this has been an international multilateral agreement that we have now given the Iranians an excuse, and we have, I think, made much more complicated our relationships with the other countries that are part of this agreement. And so I think that what happened by having the president not offer to certify and kind of put it in Congress's hands, he has weakened America, not strengthened America.
And close the conversation.
Yep, made it. I mean, I think, and I really do think that diplomacy and deals like this are not like real estate deals. This is not the same kind of. This is not business. This is diplomacy that a lot of people's lives depend on. And so I think this was an unnecessary step, and I'm hoping very much that Congress will, in fact, do what it needs to, is to understand that we don't want to get out of this, and that there are other agreements that can be made with Iran that deal with some of the issues that the president is concerned about, which is the way that they use some of their missiles and some of their other behavior within the Middle East. But it doesn't depend on tearing apart what has been and continues to be a very useful agreement in terms of getting some kind of control over Iran's nuclear program. So I think that's the important part.
Definitely. And speaking of diplomacy, I had been reading, in your history how you later on found out about your grandparents being killed in the Holocaust. And I was wondering, how has that shaped you as a person and how you approach diplomacy and as well as the fight for human rights? Well,
let me just say, I had understood the importance of America's role long before I found out about my Jewish background. And in fact, I didn't find out about that until just before I became Secretary of State. And yet before that, I had been ambassador to the United Nations. And my behavior there had a lot to do with what I saw was going on in the Balkans, where people were being ethnically cleansed, not for anything they had done, but who they were. just deciding because they were non-Serbs or Muslims that they needed to be removed from where they lived. And so I was a child of World War II, and I understood what happened if the United States didn't speak up for those that were being punished for no reason whatsoever. And so finding out about my Jewish background was something that made me feel terribly sorry for my parents, because they were dead by the time that I found out, and I was trying to put myself into their shoes about how they must have felt. We spent the war in England, and they had left their parents behind in Czechoslovakia. And obviously when they returned, everybody was dead. I was a child, so I didn't have any, I didn't know my grandparents beyond knowing them when I was 2. But mostly the finding out about my personal story just made me feel desperately sorry for my parents, and also appreciate more what they had done for us in terms of protecting us. So, but it didn't change my view of how people, what responsibilities countries had towards each other.
Yeah.
What the role of the United States had to be in terms of making sure that these kinds of things did not go on in other parts of the world. So, and I was so proud to represent the United States. And so that's why I'm kind of troubled by the direction that we're taking now, or where we believe that our strength is separating us from other countries, that we can do everything by ourselves. We can't in the 21st century. We need friends and allies. We need to be true to our word. We need to have agreements. And if we just kind of renounce them because they were done by a previous administration, we weaken America. I think what has happened with Iran, President Trump has weakened America.
Well, and it seems like what you're going to, just using one tool just doesn't
It does not work, no.
In the big picture.
No, you need to, and you need to recognize, I keep saying this over and over again, talking to another country is not a sign of weakness. It is, and it is not a gift. It is the tool that is needed in order to solve problems. That's why we have diplomats.
Absolutely. And our last question that we're going to ask today is, it's a lighter one, I think, which is good, is looking back at your incredible career, and you're so inspiring, personally and professionally, is what advice would you give back to your 20-year-old self?
Well, my 20-year-old self, I was in college still, and I did give advice to myself then to study hard and work hard, but basically I think it would have been to realize that for a woman to succeed, it was very hard to make a life plan, that it was necessary to be flexible and to use whatever capabilities one had to have a productive and interesting life. So for instance, I was going to be a journalist. I worked on my college paper. I married a journalist, and I worked on a small newspaper while he was in the Army. And then we moved to Chicago, and we're sitting there with his managing editor. I actually was 22 at that stage. And he said to me, "So what are you going to do, honey?" And I said, "I'm going to be a journalist." And he said, "I don't think so. You can't work on the same paper as your husband because of labor regulations."
Okay.
And even though there were 3 other papers in Chicago at the time, he said, "And you wouldn't want to compete with your husband." And instead of saying what you might say, or what I might say today, I basically saluted and found another life. But the bottom line is, I think that what I would say to my 20-year-old self, or my daughters, or you, is basically that having a passion and being curious and wanting to make a difference is what's important, and to be flexible, that you might not be doing what you thought you were going to do, but whatever talents you have and the desire to work hard is what one needs, and to not think that there's a life plan that you can follow from 20 age on.
And it's always evolving.
Always
Life
evolving.
is always evolving.
Right.
And that's a wonderful note, I think, to end on. And we just can't thank you enough for being with us here today. And it's
well,
been
thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
So welcome. Well,
Yeah.
thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.